Hey there, everyone. Sky Cruz here, back with another video with Project Artemis. Today, I'm here to talk about my performance at the recent Atlanta Regionals, in which I did not make day two, but I did go 6-3, just narrowly missing day two by one win. I played a pretty interesting brew of Dragapult Charizard. Credit to Cyrus Davis for this wonderful list. Um, and Today I'm going to be talking about just the deck itself, my thoughts on all of the matchups that I dealt with, and just some general game plans into decks like these and what I would have done differently about my deck list if I were to play this tournament in the future. So, going into the regional, the first thought I had was, how can I make a deck around Dragapult DX? That sounds kind of silly, right? I mean, every deck has either a Dragapult in it or an answer to Dragapult itself. So, what makes Dragapult Charizard so different? Well, interestingly enough, most of the decks in format right now don't really have an answer to the massive presence that Charizard EX puts out. Burning Darkness's ability to hit upwards of 330 damage makes it so that you're essentially establishing a board presence that makes your opponent have to play around way more at once. This means that you can put your opponent in positions that Phantom Dive doesn't quite win, but if your opponent doesn't play perfectly, Burning Darkness can clean up in the late game. For example, against other Dragapult decks, putting 20 down on a Dragapult DX means that you can do 300 with Burning Darkness once they've taken 4 prizes. Against Goldango, one of the issues in the matchup is your inability to take that final one-hit KO, which Charizard can always pick up by doing anywhere between 270 and 300, depending on what your prize map is. Um, it also gives you a good way to get Fire Energy in play without using your supporter for turn on something like Crispin. And although it is item reliant and slightly weaker to Badoo, it does give you more opportunities to completely burst out of nowhere. You do also have the double rare candy plus uh, plus Charizard option where you can go Candy Dragapult, Candy Charizard, attach Psychic, which is a little bit of a riskier play, but honestly, it can win games on its own. So just having the sheer versatility of options as opposed to a more straightforward deck like Bombless Dragapult or um, the forced aggression of Dusknoir that also puts you in riskier positions. Charizard is just a big body that does big damage. The list has a pretty standard Dragapult line of 4-4-2, just to make sure you can consistently get out your Draclooks to be attacking the Dragapults. 202 Charizard. I opted not to run Charmeleon. Charmeleon honestly doesn't feel that great if you're not running Technical Machine Evolution. And since your standard turn one play is almost always going to be Itchy Pollen, it just doesn't usually work out. Hawlucha is excellent with Dragapult in this format, the ability to punish things like Hoot Hoot, other Dreepy, Charmander, Rotom. There's a whole lot of weak 70 HP Pokemon that Hawlucha just helps Dragapult pick off in combination with Professor Turo, Fezandipity, fairly standard card. Blood Moon Ursaluna helps you clean up, so typically your prize map is going to be a Badoo into a Charizard, into a Dragapult, into a Blood Moon. Sometimes you'll use 2 of one of your big attackers, but Blood Moon is able to just do consistent damage for a low energy cost at the end of the game, as well as be recycled with Turo. So it just finds its way into the deck as a pretty solid pick. 4 Arven, 2 Jacques, 2 Iono is standard for pretty much any Dragapult deck. Some of the lists that focus less around rare candy will play Uprock Scouting or a third Jacques, but this list kind of just wants to be able to find Charizard in the mid game, as well as a Dracloak at the same time, which is something that Brock can't really accomplish. One thing I'd really like to emphasize about this list is the 2 copies of Pokegear 3.0. Pultzard in the Prismatic Evolutions format typically ran 2 copies of Lumineon V for consistency. And honestly, before Cyrus and I put these copies of Pokegear in the deck, I wasn't really finding Dragapult Charizard to be all that consistent. But the Pokegear really adds the nice balance between the early game consistency of being able to find your Jocks more often without playing 3, and the late game consistency of being able to find Boss Ion or a Turo without playing more than you need to. And so it gives you some key deck space to make sure that you can really push for consistency with 3 Ultra Ball, 2 Nest Ball, a Terra Orb, an Artisan, all of the above. We run 4 Gusting cards just because of how important Boss can be in the Dragapult mirror, how often this deck goes ahead, surprisingly, even though it's a Vadu deck. So you do still play the 2 standard counter catcher that allow you to respond easily off of a Vadu, but 2 Boss is a really important count in this particular list. You only really need 2 candy. Usually you're either getting out 1 or 2 Dragapult or 1 or 2 Charizard in a game, and you'll only be using the candy for 1 of your Dragapults. And usually Blood Moon fills in for your second Charizard, or you just manually attach for a couple of turns and just save your candies for when it matters. An interesting inclusion in this list is Energy Search over Earthen Vessel. Dragapult Charizard really doesn't have a lot of desire to search out fire energy for any particular reason, unless, of course, you don't have a Charizard in play and you've already found your Psychic Energy. But we run 5 fire because of Charizard, so fire is going to be found way more frequently. And discarding with this deck feels very, very awkward. Sometimes as regular Dragapult, you'll find yourself with a stray Buddy Buddy Puffin. But with this deck, you constantly want to make sure that you have a Charmander on board to be able to threaten high octane plays. So being able to just say, I'm going to conserve as many resources as possible and just find the Psychic Energy when I need it also lets you afford to run 2 Psychic Energy. So Energy Search finds its way into the average Dragapult Charizard list. An even split between Night Stretcher and Super Odd because of Infernal Rain. Infernal Rain, of course, allowing you to search fire energies out of your deck. But if you put the energies in your hand with a Night Stretcher, it's not really going to accomplish what you need it to. Oftentimes, you will need to use Charizard to charge multiple attackers throughout the game. So being able to just get back your resources can come in handy pretty frequently. Our ace spec is the standard Fair Stamp. Putting up a big body like Charizard hitting 210 or 240 with Defiance Band plus Unfair Stamp creates a really unbreakable position against stuff like Terrorbox and Terapagos, where you just have a big body that isn't going to get knocked out until at least 2 turns from then. So Defiance Band finds its way into the list as well as Unfair Stamp, especially for that big combo. Defiance Band also has niche inclusions with Dragapult. Being able to hit 230 is actually quite relevant against Pokemon like Pheasantipity EX, making it so that you can save your flying entry damage for somewhere else. Also making it so that your opponent promoting something like a Laios or their own Pheasantipity isn't particularly safe. Artisan as well, just a consistency card that is immune to Itchy Pollen. You can play down Artisan whenever, patch up your sore points, shut off Jamming Tower, shut off Area 0. So yeah, that's the whole deck list. Let's get into some of our matchups. So as you can see here, I hit a pretty decently wide spread of decks. I did hit 3 Goldango decks, but everything else is pretty unique. And so I feel like there are a couple of different things I can say about the decks. So starting off, we have this Goldango to Dunsparce list. Now, I'd like to clarify that thanks to the new Limitless Labs feature, I have the deck list of every opponent that I played against, even those who did not make day 2. So I have a certain amount of advantage now that I didn't have then. So I'll be both commenting on what I accounted for at the time and what I would have done differently now, knowing exactly what's in their 60. So looking at this, it's a pretty standard Goldango to Dunsparce 60. We've got the 2 Lightning plus Levinesia combo. We've got 1 Crispin, which I find interesting, to be able to search for a Metal Energy and a Dark Energy to set up the Monkey Dory in 1 turn. Pretty thick consistency line of 4 Arv and 3 Cypher. 2 Boss and a Counter Catcher makes a lot of sense, especially since you're running more 1 prizers in your list. Yeah, there's really not that much unusual here. The way I tried to approach this matchup was to use Charizard to fit together a 2/2/2 prize map if I could, if my opponent didn't really draw up to par. So what that might look like is if my opponent isn't able to get enough Goldengos by the time I can get a Dragapult out, I can go Hawlucha onto a Dunsparce or a Gimmighoul and take 2 prizes in sequence. I can go hit 230 onto the active, hit 70 onto a bench Pokemon to take it out as well, which also puts my opponent's Goldengo out of range of being able to Monkey Dory out of a Phantom Dive, which allows me to then chain a Gust onto the Monkey Dory plus a Phantom Dive 60. That can lead to another 3 prize turn. So sometimes it's a 1-3-2 prize map because Charizard is always going to be able to take those last 2 prizes for you. In this matchup, something interesting you can do using those damage numbers as well is to go attach Defiance Mane to Charizard, play Unfair Stamp, hit for 240. That'll allow you to take a 3 prize turn by knocking out Monkey Goldengo. If you can pair that with an Iono and use Counter Catcher for your gusting, your opponent's going to be in a tough spot. Honestly, for an Unfair Stamp deck, Runaway Draw is really threatening just because your opponent can draw an absurd amount of cards every turn, especially if they aren't benching the 60 HP Dunsparce, so you can't limit their play. So I almost tend to prioritize, unless my opponent has very few Gimmighoul's in play, I tend to prioritize the Dunsparces over the Gimmighoul's. I do specifically recall that in game 1, my opponent did prize 2 Gimmighoul, so that was a pretty big advantage for me in that game. It meant that they couldn't draw a ton of cards with Goldengo. It meant that there were some ways for me to easily threaten shutting them off the board, making some of their plays very awkward. One thing I didn't exactly expect was that this list was playing only 1 Dark Energy, so I didn't expect how hard it would be to find for them. So they didn't use Adrenaline particularly frequently. I thought they either just had some tough finds or tough prizes, but as it turns out, they only played 1 Dark. Knowing that there's a Crispin would have changed my plays a bit. My opponent never actually revealed this card. Being able to Crispin for a metal plus a dark is not always a common count in these lists, but it does make sense. If you want to beat the walls matchup, you want to be able to use Destructive Drill faster than turn 3. So you can use it on turn 2, start hitting the Cornerstone for 150, and so that can turn out pretty well. I can understand the inclusion of that. But the lack of the second Dark Energy almost balances that out for me. So I would be making the same plays as though they could get the Dark Energy into play because it would be a lot harder for them to guarantee that the Dark Energy is not in hand so that they can Crispin for it. Make it more difficult to search it out without an Energy Search Pro. So once I've committed the Unfair Stamp, I can pretty safely confirm that they won't be able to Crispin it out. But yeah, this resulted in a pretty smooth victory for me, just putting out the power of an early game Unfair Stamp Charizard, asking my opponent to find an Oko, and forcing them to KO 3 2-prize Pokemon throughout the game. My next match was actually against a player who finished in top 4, Karis Jones. A very pleasant opponent and very happy I got to play against this list. I saw a pretty standard bombless list. That's the no Dusknoir variant for those unaware. And honestly, this matchup for me is pretty straightforward. It's basically just start with your Badoo spam. My opponent does have the advantage of the Bravery Charm, which there's nothing I can really answer for that. So their first Badoo can last a little bit longer than mine. However, my deck also has the option of Charizard, so if my opponent decides to break Itchy Pollen first, I can pounce on things like Pheasantipity or Blood Moon or Saluna in a negative start. The first game of the set actually started with Karis finding a very low amount of Draclooks. I think maybe 1 Draclook got in play the entire game, and it was far too late. It was already time for her to attack with Ursaluna as a last-ditch effort, and I was able to hit the Ursaluna for 270 for game later. It really emphasizes how important it is to play cards like Jacques and Brock Scouting to find Dracloak, purely because in the Dragapult mirror, if you don't find Draclooks or you don't find Badoo, you're going to be in some big trouble, and both of those cards complement each other pretty nicely. I will say, I didn't exactly play around there being a second Turo in deck. There were some times where I hit into a Blood Moon or a Dragapult without necessarily expecting my opponent to be able to respond, since I had already seen their Turo used or I knew how to play around 1 Turo. I think in the future, knowing that they played second Turo would have influenced my plays a little bit more. Although, honestly, game 2 is really well played, and I don't see many errors in my gameplay. I just think it was sort of a one Pult player draws a little better than the other and is able to sort of pounce on it, especially with the presence of Monkey Dory in her deck that I just don't have. Monkey Dory, of course, can be a very big card in the mirror. It sets up perfect checkmate positions. You can move 30 to a Dragapult and then put 10 on a Dreepy, and then I can't evolve up both on the next turn. So my opponent will always be able to take that extra prize. That means if I have a damaged Dragapult in play and I don't find my one of Turo, I'm not going to be able to fully prevent whatever play they want to make on their next turn. Um, I did find this Luminous Energy pretty interesting. Playing only 3 Psychic 2 Fire is a little risky for Crispin. The Luminous Energy wasn't really super relevant, and I did see it pretty early on in the game, so I accounted for it the entire time. I do really like the inclusion of this Defiance Band. Similarly to including it in my deck, Pulp being able to hit 230, Blood being able to hit 270, it all just works incredibly well. And I have full confidence that this card is very, very good in Dragapult builds. Um, Unfortunately for me, Game 3 led to a spot where I prized my rescue board and couldn't find any energy, so I couldn't get Itchy Pollen active. And especially with the Pheasantipity start, it was just curtains. It was over faster than it started. The next deck I played against was Terapagos. Unfortunately, I don't really have much to say gameplay-wise for this match. I did double bricks, so basically just benching a Pokemon and passing. Game 1, I went down about 4 prizes before I even got a Dragapult out. My opponent went Noctowl for Area 0 plus Crispin, and then Nestball for Clefairy. It was basically over before it even started, unfortunately. But if I were to say how to play against the Terapagos matchup, it's basically just you put up a big body. Most Terapagos lists don't play Briar right now, so there's not much they can do to answer it. Things like Latios, Pheasantipity, and Clefairy will go down to Charizard pretty easily. And while a fully powered up Charizard is not capable of KOing a Charmed Terapagos until 1 prize remaining and a Defiance Band, you can play around knocking out the Bouffalants, knocking out the Hoot Hoots. A pretty common play in this matchup is to go Flying Entry onto Pheasantipity and Hoot Hoot, countercatcher the Pheasantipity, knock out Pheasantipity, Hoot Hoot, disable your opponent's draw engine, use your Turo to sometimes pick up a Charizard or a Dragapult to keep yourself out of range of these big knockouts. Sometimes Charizard is pretty afraid of Cornerstone Mask Ogerpon, but it doesn't really do much when you can just sweep in with a Dragapult. My best advice is almost always to commit your rescue board to a Charmander if you can, just so that you can not fully disable your Charizard as an option, because when you go into Dragapult, your opponent's more likely to go in with Clefairy, and if you can't Oko the Clefairy, especially a Bravery Charmed Clefairy, you're going to be in some big trouble. Unfortunately, none of these strategies really got to be used, and I started off the day at 1-2, which is not a good place to be starting. Honestly, my nerves were kind of with me at the time, and I just sort of had to breathe through it. You got to remember that not every tournament is going to be your tournament, and not every tournament is going to start with a perfect 3-0 opener. I've had my fair share of 3-0 openers, and I've almost had just as many good openers that didn't end well as I had bad openers that did. So I really think, just as a side note, that it's important to keep in mind that until you're out of the tournament, you're just not out of the tournament. You can't give up before the getting is good. The next deck I played against was this very interesting, almost Terra-boxy Charizard deck. It plays along a lot of the theories of Dragapult Charizard by taking advantage of the setup power of Charizard with cards like Clefairy, Wellspring, Ogerpon, and Terapagos, just to be able to output big damage in a bunch of different ways. This matchup was very, very difficult for me, as my opponent started Wellspring Ogerpon both games with an attachment. So they were basically immediately threatening Torrential Pump. My only out really was to go with a fast unfair stamp plus Charizard EX, although they did play pretty smart and made sure to use TM Evolution into Pidgeotto and Charmeleon as fast as possible, just to be able to get out that Pidgeotto EX on the first turn. I was able to narrowly win out this match, partially thanks to a double prize penalty in Game 2. My opponent drew 5 cards off of Unfair Stamp. I think it's important to be honest about that. If I just said that I won that game through natural means, I wouldn't really be doing it justice. Um, and in all honesty, I think my opponent's deck was honestly simply better than mine. I was really intrigued by this version of the deck, and I really had no idea what cards they were playing. Honestly, I would not have expected that they were only running a 2-2 Noctowl line with how consistently they were able to get it out. This deck basically just begs a Dragapult Charizard player to have an Iono turn 1, have an Iono turn 2. That's the only supporter you should ever be playing in this matchup on your early turns. But you don't always have the option to. And if you can't get there because of how powerful Charizard is, they can just blow you out of the water. So fortunately, with a good combination of Itchy Pollen plus those plays that knock out things like Pidgey Hoot Hoot or Pheasantipity Hoot Hoot, was able to put me in a position where I could just swing with a big Charizard, take down their Pidgeot, and then just force them into a checkmate position with Turbo plus Burning Darkness to a full HP Charizard when they could only do 300 damage. So at this point, I was 2-2, kind of unsure what I would hit next, but I had a pretty standard Terra Box list, I would say. There's a couple of interesting cards here, those being the Terra Orb and the Tapu Koko EX. But honestly, those aren't really cards that I need to worry about. Terra Orb, of course, is just a little extra consistency, and Tapu Koko is really only for water weak Pokemon like Wellspring Mask Ogerpon or Milotic. It's never one-shotting a Charizard or a Dragapult. And in fact, it gets one-shot by Dragapult itself. The Terra Box matchup is honestly pretty similar to the way I play the early game of the Noctowl Charizard matchup, due to the fact that they're always going to open with the Torrential Pump, and you need to follow up with a big Unfair State Charizard play, except they actually have less counterplay. They can put up the big body of Charizard. They don't have Pidgeot for consistency. Usually you're combining that Unfair Stamp with the Counter Catcher on the TLS Gopherpon with an energy, so they're never going to be able to one-shot you. Again, if you notice that the list runs a Cornerstone, I always recommend committing Rescue Board to the Charizard to make sure that it never gets stranded. And honestly, once I got out of Charizard, my opponent was almost never able to break it. So Charizard ran away with 4 prizes pretty fast, and I was able to just clean up the last 2 with a Dragapult or a Blood Moon. There was some pretty scary positions where I just very much dead drew, had to go in with the Blood Moon and try and take 6 prizes. This was pretty unsuccessful. My opponent did end up being able to super odd for their Blood Moon at the end of the game, despite a few key turns off. They played pretty smart by not playing into my rescue board, funnily enough. I actually did end up in some situations where I had to contemplate using rescue board's secondary effect to get Blood Moon free retreat. But my opponent played pretty smart, repeatedly used Sob to make sure that I was always giving them the Blood Moon or Saluna. And so it was a well played, that game in particular was pretty well played by my opponent. But I do need to highlight the consistency issues that come with only playing a 3-3 Noctowl line. They did struggle to find a Noctowl at one point, and that seems like a pretty clear punish for playing a little bit thin on the Noctowl. So at this point, I'm 3-2. Haven't really played against anything too out there outside of this Charizard list. Feeling pretty good about my record. Feeling like I can make that run back. I'm at 3-2 now. In the next round, I hit another Goldango deck. This one is a little less consistent than the Dunsparce version necessarily is. They played 2 Scyther, the Scizor EX, which is for Cornerstone, also does a respectable amount of damage. I mean, 240, 250 with the Brute on it isn't really bad at all. Although I never really got attacked with the Scizor, despite its somewhat inherent prowess against Dracloaks. But my opponent ended up in a bunch of situations where they were just never able to find. They were never able to set up the Scizor, and so I was able to KO 2 Scythers at the same time, go for that 2-2-2 line that I mentioned against the Goldango to Dunsparce player, where I could just go take out a Gimmighoul and a Scyther, double Scyther or Monkey Dory Scyther, something like that, or just take the early prize, hit for 240 or 230, and then clean up later. The Brute it never hit the board in this matchup, which was pretty smart by my opponent. You don't really want to walk into those more deadly ranges by poisoning yourself and taking that damage. The Turo is definitely pretty interesting. I never actually saw this card. I think Turo is one of the hardest cards to play around in the Goldango matchup as a Dragapult deck. One of the reasons why the matchup is better than it used to be is because most Goldangos are really playing Turo. I have to imagine if my opponent had actually been able to pull off a Turo play, I would have been in a lot of trouble. Um, Otherwise, Jamming Tower makes some of my plays a little more difficult. They did at one point shut off my Defiance band, but I did put them into a position where they couldn't get out Monkey Dory, so I wasn't punished by the existence of the Jamming Tower at all. Um, Overall, pretty standard list. Pretty tough to face, given some of the options that they have access to. With the Goldango matchup, just one good break for the Dragapult Charizard player is enough to run away with the game, and each time, either off an Iono or an unfair stamp, I was able to get a good break. The next match I played against was this very interesting Miraidon build. You may recognize this from a recent Sage and Park post in which he mentioned that he played this to a big Korean event. Joltik Miraidon is pretty interesting. It's actually a Miraidon deck that plays 0 copies of Electric Generator. It plays Iron Hands. It plays Pikachu plus Gravity Mountain for big Stage 2 Pokemon. And it has the capability to just, with a few good beats and a few key misses from your opponent, to just completely wipe you off the board. I felt pretty perspective about this matchup because of the fact that there was Charizard in my deck. Being able to KO Iron Hands as soon as it takes a knockout is very good. But my opponent got down the Heavy Baton early, was able to set up Pikachu pretty easily. Actually pulled off an interesting play where I went on Fair Stamp. They responded with the Topaz Bolt into a late game draw of the Gravity Mountain to take out a Charizard and respond with an Iron Hands plus Magneton play. Unfortunately, I was forced to Iono on a turn where I really wanted to combo Dragapult with Defiance Band into knocking out Iron Hands and Magnemite at the same time. But I was not able to do so. And so game one went by pretty quickly, given that my opponent was just able to go 2 and then passive hit and then a 4 and then a full price turn. Um, I was honestly sweating pretty hard. And in game 2, I made my first really major misplay of the tournament, a game losing one. So the board was Joltik that had taken 20 from a combination of Itchy Pollen plus um, had taken a combination of Itchy Pollen plus Phantom Dive damage, so just the 10 from Phantom Dive, because I wanted the Joltik to remain in play. I put 200 on a Pikachu to not take prizes and not wreck Pheasantipity or anything like that. And I had just done enough damage to the Iron Hands to be able to take it out. My opponent had a full Iron Hands fully set up, and I had just had to go for a couple turns of Badoo and set up a big 4 prize into 2 prize turn. So my opponent had a fully set up Iron Hands and no Magnemite in play. I was able to take out their Pikachu plus their Mew because of Halucha damage. But unfortunately, I made the mistake of taking advantage of that Joltik with Flying Entry and putting it to 30 and knocking it out. If I were to inquire why I did this, I'm really not sure. But it activated my opponent's Counter Catcher, a card I very much should have figured they ran, and gave them way more outs to win the game from there. And so they just hit an Ampy very much on one of my Pokemon, and I unfortunately lost the set. Misplays like that feel pretty tough, especially when they knock you out of a tournament. Your nerves are high, and the adrenaline just sort of saps from your body. It's an unfortunate end to a tournament run, really, knowing that you could have played that better, knowing that you could have gone to a game 3, knowing that you could have given it an even better shot. But honestly, that's just the way Pokemon is sometimes. If you're not learning from your mistakes, you're just doing it wrong. And so I think it's really important to acknowledge where exactly you slipped up, where you can do better, and what your next step should be in going through the tournament. For me, definitely, even now, sometimes I still just forget to think about cards like Counter Catcher or Counter Game that can really punish sloppy play. And so it's definitely a big one going into my next tournament to continue to figure out to play around. Overall, though, I think this list was very cool. And if there's anything I would have liked to have lost to, it's a very spicy build that has a surprisingly good matchup spread. I'm looking forward to playing a deck like this in the future. But of course, even though I'm now 4-3, uh, I didn't really have any desire to stop playing. I need every point I can get for Worlds, and so I moved on to round 8. Round 8 was against another Goldango deck, this time, of course, being the Dragapult variant. Goldango Dragapult can be pretty threatening sometimes because of their access to Dragapult, the increased throughout game drone of Recon Directive, and the double Crispin inclusion. Dracloak, of course, stays on the board longer than the Dunsparce can. You don't need to repeatedly get it out every turn. But the low HP does actually create some interesting strategies. Of course, with the Dunsparce, it has 130 HP. That's more than 2 Phantom Dives, and it shuffles itself back into the deck. You're never going to be able to manipulate the Dracloak in the way that you want to. But it kind of acts like a slightly bigger Scyther or Dunsparce, in that with a couple of turns of Itchy Pollen or a Flying Entry hit, you can take it into some really interesting HP ranges, either force your opponent to evolve it into Dragapult, which honestly doesn't end up being that good of a card in any Dragapult matchups. It's very good in other matchups, but it just doesn't do a lot against Dragapult decks, especially those capable of hitting big damage with Charizard or pushing back with Monkey Dory. So you can just sort of set up those big combination prize turns where you can go Itchy Pollen a couple times into them having difficulties moving their Dreepy. Maybe they didn't find the energy they needed, and they can't Energy Search Pro under Itchy Pollen. Of course, if they Dragon Headbutt, you will always be able to take advantage of that by going Unfair Stamp. They won't even have a Metal on their Dingo, let alone a Dark on their Monkey Dory. There's almost no way they could go Crispin to get out Metal Dark +7 more energy. So it usually ends up being totally fine to be able to take out a Dracloak really early if they go for Dragon Headbutt. My opponent was, of course, smarter than that, did not go for that play, but played a pretty respectable set. They had a lot of issues missing metal energy in the early game, so I was able to pretty freely set up, get a few key Itchy Pollens down onto Dracloaks and set up that 2-2-2 line that I talked about. Um, of course, Jamming Tower, big threat, threatens my rescue board, threatens my Defiance Band, but I was able to find Artisan at the opportune time, and basically when you're playing against Goldango Dragapult deck that can't use Phantom Dive, you're just playing against a slightly less consistent Goldango variant. They lack Cypher Maniac for consistency, so they need to find an additional superior energy retrieval instead of just being able to Cypher Maniac for both the ones needed to take out a giant 2-prize Pokemon. So especially if you're able to swing in with a second Charizard at the end of the game, they'll often have a difficult time taking it out because you're reducing their draw. You might countercatcher a Pheasantipity to take it out, or just hit 300 into the Goldango and force them to spend an energy on an attachment. So this match went pretty cleanly, pretty well, and it was a quick 2-0. Going into round 9 and a 5-3 record, I would say I was feeling relatively confident. Whenever I'm at 5-3, I feel like I almost always win. I'm pretty comfortable with where I'm at. I've gotten past the stage of denial about making day 2, and I'm just ready to have a good last game. The final deck I played against was this interesting Archaludon Pidgeot build. Pidgeot plus Monkey Dory actually causes a lot of problems for Dragapult. Usually you're trying to set up these big 5-prize turns where you wipe something like 2 Archaludons, or like an Archaludon, a Pheasantipity, and the Relicanth. Relicanth actually a very big liability, even though it helps the Archaludon player take knockouts in tandem with Black Belt's training. I actually wasn't aware that my opponent's Pidgeot line was this heavy. A 3-2-3 line is a bit of a crazy amount of Pidgeot, especially since they're only playing one rare candy. They often went for the manual evolution into Pidgeot over time, which allowed me to pretty cleanly anticipate their plays, take knockouts on Pidgeys, and set up around the Pidgeot. My opponent did get one Pidgeot per game, but I was always able to take it out with a combination of Itchy Pollen plus Phantom Dive, both as the damage counters to the bench and the hit to the active. Um, And yeah, Monkey Dory definitely put me in a lot of troublesome situations. I had to make a very interesting play in game one where my Dracloak had 60 on it. My Charizard was in range of being knocked out if I hit back. Um, of being knocked out at all, that is. And my opponent had three prizes remaining, so I just had to sit there and not take a prize, and either hope at some point my opponent misstepped, or hope that I could evolve my Dracloak into Dragapult with the Nice Tricker. My last Dragapult was in my last two prize cards. So interestingly, our Paladon, despite being a very heavy hitter deck, was pushed to a pretty intense stalemate. So very good games by my opponent. I think honestly, I was a little too scared of Pidgey almost. Um, every time there was a Pidgey in play, I almost immediately went for the Phantom Dive knockout on it. Knowing now that there's only one rare candy, um, I don't think I would have done that as frequently. I think it might have just been better to take on the Monkey Dories. Of course, my opponent doesn't play Arven, so it's a little harder for them to consistently set up Arcal plus Monkey Dory plus Pidgeot every game, unless you're giving them ample time to do so. Which, of course, playing an unfair stamp deck means that as soon as they take the first knockout, you're not letting them stay that consistently in the game. So my opponent never actually got off a Candy Pidgeot. They were always forced to manually evolve into Pidgeotto, take the extra turn, have that extra bit of predictability instead of a burst Pidgeot out of nowhere. So I was always able to say, okay, Pidgeot is coming out next turn. What can I do? How can I respond? Which, of course, you should always do. But knowing that it was evolving through Pidgeotto gave me some extra time to set up my board and prepare, instead of putting me on a quick 2-turn clock for a Candy Pidgeot. But overall, I would say my opponent played a pretty difficult matchup very well. Um, I am not ashamed to say that I was knocked out by Blustery Wind on my Badoo at least one time. Um, my opponent really knew what they were doing in this matchup. It was very clear that they had tested it. But unfortunately, our Paladon really struggles with Charizard EX, so it just wasn't enough. And I finished at a 6-3 record, which is something that I can be relatively proud of. Here's an overall recap of everything that happened during my tournament. As you can see, I did hit a wide variety of decks despite hitting 3 Goldingo. Um, I think all of my opponents played pretty well. I think for the most part, I did everything I could to win games, outside of that one game against Miraidon. And so a finish like this honestly feels pretty solid, you know? It's not a day two, but it is a 512 placement, putting me at 514 points for the season. So I would say that in terms of my road to worlds, this was a pretty clean finish. Some things I might change about my list, honestly. Um, I kind of found myself wanting another way to search my evolutions or basics throughout the day. So a rock scouting seems pretty opportune. I think maybe something like an Ultra Ball might be eligible to cut, although I feel a little bit strange saying that. I did think about Orban, as some of the higher placing Dragapult lists didn't necessarily play as many Arven as is expected nowadays, only playing 2 Arven, 2 Research. But Arven is usually finding Poffin against non Badoo decks, and cutting an Arven for a Brock kind of feels like a very different purpose, especially because Arven can search Stamp plus Defiance Band so consistently, Rescue Work plus Poffin for Badoo. I do remember the second copy of Counterculture not being as valuable as I necessarily would have liked, so maybe a Rock Scouting would have been better there. It was a Klefki or a TM Evolution for a while. So there's a couple of cards that slot could be. Overall, I think prioritizing consistency is really important with this deck. You just want to be able to set up as often as possible, and so a card like Rock Scouting might be good. Um, but overall, I think it was a pretty solid list. I think one matchup that I'm particularly excited to try out is the Gardevoir matchup. Of course, Charizard having a unique advantage against Gardevoir, being one of the few things in format that's able to hit it for weakness. Dragapult being able to take down things like Drifloon. But both of these cards have a weakness to the common Mew EX. You can't really set up a Charizard and a Badoo, so maybe in that matchup I'd need to invest in a Charmeleon tech. But it's definitely something I'm excited to try out. Excited to see if Dragapult Charizard continues to have a place in this meta, maybe as a Dragapult variant that has a better matchup against Gardevoir, where others might struggle. Um, but overall, very happy with this list. You can't go wrong with it. If you play it to Elite Cup, well, I would expect a good placement, honestly. You just got to play what I like to call good Dragapult, which is understanding your pacing, understanding when to go in, when to stay back with Itchy Pollen. Mid-game Itchy Pollen is a pretty big one that I feel like a lot of people miss out on. But overall, that covers my performance at Atlanta Regionals with Dragapult Charizard. I hope you enjoyed this video. Of course, if you want to find me, you can find me at Skyline01 on almost every platform. And you can find Project Artemis on Metafy, on Twitter, and on Blue Sky. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.